to welcome all of you to the Bonar Institute webinar series. And I'm delighted that you have joined us this evening, and we hope you enjoy it and come back for many more. The format of our webinar series is that we have about a 20-minute presentation, and then we'd like to have as much audience participation and discussion as possible. Make it very conversational. We have a lot of wonderful expertise here, and we want you to walk away from this webinar happier than when you entered it. So I'd like to introduce Christine Wozorek, and Christine and I have two interesting connections. Not only are we passionate about leadership and human capital and human resources. I live in Wheeling, Illinois, and it turns out that Christine used to live here as well many years ago. The world is small after all. So I'm delighted. Christine is such an impressive talent, and I'd like to go over a little bit of Christine's background. First of all, Christine is CEO and founder of Utah-based White Label Advisors. This is a human capital strategy and management company. I'm delighted to state that White Label Advisors has a very interesting value proposition. White Label Advisors is able to blend human capital, business strategy, and financial strategy through the lens of human behavior to increase the bottom line of organizations and help them innovate. Christine has been named a disruptor in 2019 by Utah Magazine, and she has also, at the invitation of Forbes, surely you know Forbes magazine, Forbes has an invitation-only organization called the Forbes Human Resources Council, and Forbes invited Christine to be part of the Human Resources Council. And if you go to Forbes and type in her name at the Forbes website, you'll see her biography and the articles that appear there. I'd also like to note that Christine has done a lot of work with boards of directors and the C-suite. And she's also known for a lot of work in developing female talent and in the workplace, which is a very big need. And Christine resides in Utah. And at this point, I am delighted that I get to listen to Christine's presentation along with you. And after that, we'll unmute well, I don't know. I can't say phone lines anymore. That dates me, doesn't it? But we'll unmute everyone and we can have a conversation. So Christine, so excited to hear your presentation this evening. And I'm going to go on mute now.
Thank you so much, John. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. So thanks for sharing your evening with us. And I hope that we achieve the objective that John has laid out so nicely, that we just hope you're in a happier place than before you came. So with that, I'm delighted to present on HR, the Great Facilitator, this evening, Tuesday, November 15th, 2022, at the Bonar Institute for Purposeful Leadership webinar. John prepared a wonderful introduction. The one piece that I'm most thrilled about is I've recently accepted an advisory board position with the Bonar Institute for Purposeful Leadership, and am delighted to serve with many wonderful members there. So my very simple purpose, yet poignant purpose, is to redefine business strategy with human intelligence. And to do that, I think it's really important that as we talk about tonight with the HR is the Great Facilitator, it's important to understand the history of HR, the primary connective groups within an organization, and how we facilitate those connections. So most of us don't know that HR has a really interesting foundation. And in the US, back in the the 30s and 40s, we had, hundreds of thousands of troops that were serving in the armed forces. And when World War II ended, we saw a flood of those troops coming back home and then patriating into the workforce. Many of them had not had a professional job because of the draft, and they were called up fairly young. So now, the workforce has a flood of individuals that are new to a professional career and do not have any personnel records. So the military, the armed forces in the US, actually transferred many of those personnel records for the troops over to organizations as they became employed. And that was the foundational roots of HR in the US. Additionally, move forward a couple decades, and in the 60s, we start to see a lot of activity around merger arbitrage, which James might appreciate this, but the arbitrage is a French word. The English translation is scalper. And in mergers, M&As, they chose the word arbitrage because it was less aggressive, less offensive. And we see a lot of merger arbitrage activity in the 60s through the 80s, where it's very cutthroat, overtaking organizations, and having no appreciation or regard for talent and the impact there. Then additionally, around the same time, we have large corporations that are emerging like IBM, Kodak. And to create a competitive advantage for their talent acquisition or recruiting processes, they essentially create a benefits program for incoming candidates. We had a lot of individuals, veterans that were receiving, care from the VA, yet newly entering professionals that were no longer considered veterans or had VA benefits needed a benefit plan. And so these large organizations identified a need in the new generation of workforce coming in and created benefits plans. There's no place to really put the administration for benefits, so it essentially was handed off to the HR department. Ultimately, as we, as leaders of an organization, we're focused on purpose, we're focused on mission, vision, and values. But more foundationally than that, we need trust to essentially drive the culture. And if we don't have trust, a culture will happen, whether it's intentional or not. Yet we want it to be intentional, and we need it to be intentional so that it fully operationalizes and optimizes the organization to achieve those intended outcomes. And so with HR's role, we talked about at the very beginning how it started out very transactionally, just essentially a transfer of personnel records from the military to organizations, and then how it in some ways kind of haphazardly evolved because of changing workforce needs, to today where it is a strategic partner, not only in crisis management, but supporting leadership in virtual management, as was a catalyst from the pandemic. And so we can see it in a very different way. We can see that all of these stakeholders that are listed here, in these four main groups, essentially, if we visualize the interconnectivity between each group and those kind of lines of communication flowing, that gives us 34 lines of communication, and that's complex. And we need a method to essentially decentralize a common denominator amongst the org that's defined by the executive team throughout each of these groups, not only for common understanding, but so that they can connect very cohesively and work effectively together. So HR's role in facilitating these connections, it's strategically through full integration. And full integration means it is mapping to each business unit of the org and through each of its kind of main functions: talent acquisition, communication strategies, total reward strategies, performance management, all the way through dignified separations. And then training and development of each group. Culture has to be intentional, but so does the development and the experience that we give to individuals so that we can run a fully integrated HR program. So the right talent that we hired in 2 years ago has a pathway to growth and fulfillment, at the current intersection of 2 years in, and then looking forward to their future with us. And then measurement and reporting, it's critical. Something that the SEC has implemented just back in November of 2020. So we're just at a 2-year mark with the SEC requirement, but it's now requiring human capital reporting. And that's something that White Label provides to our clients, regardless of the client being public or not, is because of how critical measurement and reporting is. How do we know what we're achieving if we're not measuring it? And it's so important to move away from this idea that the qualitative aspects of people cannot be calculated or quantified, and we certainly can. So with that, as we look to achieving outcomes, and this is all outlined in the article HR the Great Facilitator, and John mentioned, if you go to the Forbes Human Council website, type in my name, it'll just populate there. But as we talk about outcomes from the organization, we want HR to run in a decentralized capacity. That means it's directly and actively supporting growth goals and initiatives of the organization, and those are short-term and long-term. It's enabling an equitable and inclusive culture. The HR department helps the org run optimally and efficiently through KPIs. So we're actively measuring, what we established in, our talent acquisition process as, a highly successful candidate, what they should look like. We're integrating that all the way through performance management and training and developing the managers to be able to have highly effective conversations to make sure that we are staying consistent with those performance expectations. On the outcomes for people leaders, we need highly capable people leaders to work with HR as a strategic partner to act on feedback for continuous improvement in systems, processes, and tools, inform and collaborate on development needs for their team and individual contributors. They need to be convening for strategic org design analysis. That means how scalable is our growth today based on the way that we're structuring our teams? Is this achieving our career pathing goals so that we can ensure that we have a fully diverse, inclusive, and accepting organization that's reflected in our leadership metrics up to the highest levels in the org? And developing know-how for providing fulfillment opportunities. I mentioned, having effective conversations. So those one-on-ones or those skip levels with, a higher level leader down to, their direct reports, employees, so that we potentially don't have these gaps or the risks of managers managing up effectively, but not doing a good job actually leading their people. And then again, analyzing those KPIs to suggest performance indicators. Then for the executive teams, Our executives should be highly engaged in an equitable and inclusive culture and work with HR as a strategic partner to identify and define inspirational leadership and its permeability throughout the organization. Identify and define workforce demographics to understand employee needs and tooling for each connected group. Workforce demographics have a far-reaching impact. That's a whole webinar where we could talk about that. But we mentioned workforce demographics. We mentioned how HR evolved because of the needs of a new generation coming into the workforce. But also executives, should be setting expectations for data analysis and reporting to glean insights for informed decision making, and developing know-how for engaging with individual contributors. We don't want this big gap between our executive team and the employees. What are we doing effectively to help employees meet executives, and executives care about reaching new employees coming into the organization? And then systematically, how can we incorporate, at a year, anniversary dates, those executive leaders reaching out to those employees to congratulate them, or maybe better yet, thank them for sticking with them. Then the outcomes for the individual contributors. Our 3 simple metrics at White Label for measuring employee engagement, which is productivity stated in non-financial terms, is the employee happy, which we all will be at the end of this, fulfilled, and then safe. Do we have the psychological and physical safety within our work teams and within the org? So for that, is HR informing of life events or personal conditions that are impacting reliability and predictability on the job to get a leg up on maybe some performance conversations that we need to have, and supporting additional bandwidth or cross-functional teams in the event someone needs to take an extended leave of absence. Exploring fulfillment opportunities in the org. What employee resource groups can we incorporate, or other ad hoc groups that will drive fulfillment for the org, and essentially get individuals in the company that maybe don't often work together, working together in a unique capacity, so that we have good knowledge transfer as well as good cohesive synergy. And then also providing communications to individual contributors that are offering transparency into company initiatives, into programs, growth opportunities, survey results, and even a state of the state. It's really interesting. We're having a lot of conversations right now with executive teams about, an appropriate level of transparency and vulnerability. They shouldn't be afraid to offer that to their company. Yet that involves a lot of strategic work up front so that they can speak to the decisions that they're making, and, kind of running that SWOT analysis or explaining that SWOT analysis to their organization. So there's good confidence that the leaders have a good plan, that they're aware of, some of the weaknesses or threats, or just, kind of economic pressures that are happening right now. And they can have an effective conversation with their leaders. So they're not feeling like there's concern about job security, or there's concern about, where their company is going to be in a year, and how it relates to them. So I think what's really important is that, as I said in the article, in a state of transcendence, we as humans have stepped up to support others beyond ourselves because we've taken progressional steps to improve ourselves to a state of well-being. And the same principle can be applied to key functions, departments, and stakeholders within an organization, but specifically in this case with HR. And so with that, I'm happy to end there. And then, John, I'll turn the time back over to you for questions and more dialogue.
Well, I definitely have a question. And I carefully studied your biography and the articles you've written. And there's a question I have because I encounter the topic in a lot of places. And I promise that I won't ask a lot of questions because I want everyone else to ask questions. But this one I think is pressing. And David Fraser, who is on this call, I know will be interested in this topic. So I'm a member of the Institute for Innovation in Large Organizations, involved in the artificial intelligence group, and I've worked, of course, in very large global organizations, and I've encountered the following theme: how to use artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms to not only supplement human talent, but to supervise or replace human talent. There are two prominent examples in the news. Elon Musk recently eliminated the human content moderation team at Twitter, stating that their function can be replaced by artificial intelligence algorithms. I would not agree with that conclusion, but that is indeed his conclusion. And Microsoft News, which I used to rely on, one of the reasons I liked it is it had a human editorial team to curate the content that was in MSN News, but Microsoft decided to eliminate that team and instead rely on algorithms. I actually have a long history dating back to the 1990s in applying machine learning to curate content. I've learned about its strengths and weaknesses. In the Institute for Innovation in Large Organizations and in my own work in large companies, I've heard executives say, well, the business case for using artificial intelligence is to eliminate full-time employees and we can save money. I think this is a critical issue. And what you've just talked about, human resources as a facilitator, I think is a huge issue, because not only is it a facilitator, it's helping to, I think HR is going to need to be able to articulate what is the relationship between artificial intelligence and human capital. And it might even be industry specific. It might differ by function, but I'd love to get your views on that. And I hope that others will unmute their, not phone lines anymore, but I've got to figure out the contemporary word for it so I won't appear old anymore. But unmute your Zoom system and also participate in the conversation. So Christine, what do you think about the wonderful AI issue? And I'm sure you've encountered it.
Well, John, I'm so happy that you've brought AI into this conversation. I think it's critical. It's, with David Fraser, your book, is about innovation and transformation. But before I start, John, I just want to share a memory really quick.
Yeah.
In our house in Wheeling, Illinois, my mom added the long extension cord on the phone so she could walk around the kitchen. And her mute button for us was throwing the pencil at us. Just she had a really good arm.
It worked.
Yep, really good aim. But with that, with AI, what does this mean for HR and kind of the human function within an organization? I have to say that I'm a huge fan of innovation and AI. I'm very excited for the potential that it offers. I'll share why in a minute, but knowing the risks, right? Knowing that it's humans programming the algorithms. And so how do we design in equity and fairness to that? Europe has done a wonderful job. I think they're ahead of the game in the US. I met with the EEOC commissioner at a conference earlier this year in Las Vegas, and he is starting up an AI task force to meet with HR professionals and HR tech companies to answer this question that you're posing today. Mm-hmm. The reason why I think it is essentially the forefront for organizations and workforces is it does not, in my opinion, replace humans. It makes humans more effective in delivering our intelligence as it should be delivered. And I'll use the example of talent acquisition, or recruiting. that largely falls under the HR umbrella. And as organizations grow, they'll bring in their own TA partner to manage that function because it's essentially sales. Well, think about all of the iterative steps that it takes to move a candidate through a process. Reference checks, the knock-in, knock-out questions, the screening call. So if we had if we had AI, one that was developed equitably and fairly, imagine what that AI could do for us to filter through candidates so that by, running the candidate through, the company's chosen, profile assessment or personality assessment, and how that assessment relates to the role. And it's incorporating this individual's own values and mission and purpose and aligning it to the org, how much more quickly we can move that candidate through the hiring process and get to, ensure that most of our time is spent getting really clear on alignment, reviewing a work sample from that individual, because interviews in and of themselves are horrible indicators of performance. And then aligning on culture so that we can make that right hire. So I think AI has a lot of potential, just, using TA as an example, to move things through. It has to be scrutinized, and it will continue to evolve.
I fully agree with what you've said. What I am observing and what my colleagues are observing is that executives are concluding it saves money, it looks good on the spreadsheet, lower quality is okay. I see that David Fraser has his hand up. David, I think you can unmute your line. If you're not, we can unmute you, but I know that you have explored this topic extensively, and in your webinar, I'd like to remind everyone, we have David's webinar on our YouTube channel and our Bonar Institute website, and we discuss this topic as well. I encourage going back to that webinar. David.
Well, I don't want to monopolize my questions because I could ask 1,000 tonight, Christine. First of all, the term HR, I have to share my personal bias that I find a person is not a resource, but they are the most important asset that any company has. And, just the term HR, especially given today's woke agenda, I think people would rather view themselves something a little bit more than a resource, and love to have your comments about that. The second thing is that machines today are producing more information in a day than the humans have actually produced in our almost entire existence on the earth. And so the question is, how does HR now measure the effectiveness of what machines are actually delivering in the way of services? And the other thing is, what is your comments about leadership in a digital age, when in fact it's still all about people, but we do now have a new colleague, and that is a machine that may intellectually be only 2 or 3 years old, but is growing up very quickly. So I'm just going to stop there with those and just kind of get your feedback on that, and where do you see the trend, particularly given your value proposition of how do you pull in human assets, financial and strategic planning within that digital environment? Over.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks, David. The first one, I completely agree with you. HR is outdated as a term. I use it occasionally and intentionally, based on, I would say, kind of the sloth pace that we're transforming that function, right? Or the title for that function. So James and John know quite well, I prefer human capital. We talk about kind of, having a human-centric kind of program. So I agree with you. The woke generation, I just think generally, no one wants to be considered a resource, right? We all have unique value and want to bring that to the org. The second question, do you mind reminding me what that is specifically? Just want to make sure I answer it correctly.
Just about how are you going? Well, I'll just jump into it. How are you going to lead organizations where it's a colleague is now a machine?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you manage, the algorithms? And essentially, what I've been saying in my next book is that you got to talk to programmers now, people you don't normally lead, because all the ethical training and all the input, the investment we put into people, you got to make sure that the algorithm has the same investment, because today programs are still written by too many white Anglo-Saxon men who live in California, and there's an inherent bias within that sort of rubric that we've got to break.
Mm-hmm.
So HR has a key aspect to make sure that the inclusivity and diversity that we've talked about is not just in the people, but it's also in the algorithms and the machines that we use too.
Mm-hmm.
So, how is HR evolving to that?
Great question. I like to essentially lump that in under scalability, because essentially that's what the tech is helping us innovate, is to become more scalable or more efficient so that we can scale. So under that scalability umbrella for a highly functional human capital program is systems and process. And if we're looking at it through the lens of how equitable is this technology, and how fair is it, and is it truly supporting the organization's initiatives in those ways, we have to get clear on what those systems and processes should be without the tech, and then essentially is the tech mirroring that. And I think if we particulate it out like that, it's very helpful to see. And then that I believe numbers don't lie, and so it's really important for HR professionals to understand data, not only financially, but also just through KPIs, so that if we're bringing in, let's say, a new tech solution to help us innovate in a certain area, we better have data to understand what it was like in the prior state without the technology, so that we can measure that change once the technology has been implemented, and then understand as a measurement of that change, was the change better, was it worse, and what are the intended results of implementing that technology that we couldn't foresee or maybe we missed. And so I think in and of itself, as a company's introducing new technology, because it's made a decision to innovate, then it has to incorporate a plan on introducing that technology. And I think a really important word here is beta. It almost needs to run that technology and introduce it to a sample set and run it in beta to get ahead of what the impact and the outcomes are going to be, whether they're intended or not. And I agree with you on who's programming this and creating the algorithms. I had the opportunity to work with one of the leading AI development groups, and they're based out of Prague. And they have a very different perspective of the world, because they're in a different part of the world, but it's still predominantly male. And that's just something that we're going to have to work through, I think, as humans, is incorporating other individuals into those programming teams and those design teams, so that as we're training the data, because for the audience here, with AI, with machine learning or natural language processing, you create the algorithm, and then the algorithm has to be trained. It's like a dog. So you have to give it data to process. And then what's so fascinating about AI is that it can learn from itself. But it can't learn if it doesn't have the inputs first. And so, as an organization, I would just recommend that for the audience, if you are considering new technology, that you're essentially purchasing technology that's within the consumer viable product stage, not the minimum viable product stage, because the MVPs haven't been beta tested yet.
Thank you.
I do want to note, Christine and I are both trained in psychometric testing technology. James also from Predictive Index, which interestingly has a history going back to American military personnel in the Korean War, which coincides interestingly with the history of HR that Christine outlined. What is interesting about psychometric testing is that some of the insights from psychometric testing are so deep and accurate, they've had to be suppressed on ethical grounds. It is possible to discover sociopathy, psychopathy, and other negative tendencies, and it raises a lot of privacy issues. I've talked to developers of the AI-based algorithms of psychometric testing used in HR. So, Christine, one of the questions I have is, how does White Label Advisors incorporate Predictive Index into its practice of making HR and, let's say, human capital management the connector and facilitator? How do you do that ethically in a productive way?
Great question, John. Thank you for bringing this into the discussion. I always love using a narrative. And just today, I was having a conversation with an HR professional for a large organization. And we were talking about Predictive Index as a solution for her and their organization, because they're having trouble really identifying the right hires. And with the Predictive Index, like you said, John, it's wildly accurate. And I learned a lot about myself when I took it, to the point of making a career decision to start White Label, because I realized I was a captain. And a captain is a CEO profile. And I realized I'm a horrible employee and I should just go be a captain. And so it's worked out well so far. But with that kind of personal experience, and as I was sharing with this, head of HR today, is that each role in an org, if we kind of take a financial, division, and we look at the different roles of, an AR clerk, an AP clerk, a controller, an FP&A individual, their Predictive Index profiles will be a little bit different. Our FP&A person will most likely be within one of those analyzer profiles, where our AR clerk is going to be very task-oriented and detail-oriented, and they're going to love checking boxes. And so with PI, you can actually design the role around these profiles so that you can, predict or estimate the success of a person and their alignment to the role just based on the profile. It takes a lot of work, but it's an investment. And, for a larger org that has, let's say, 150 to 200, job descriptions, it's probably a 3-month project, but that's a quarterly sprint. And you can invest in that so that, part of your talent acquisition process, once a candidate makes it through a certain point, they take this PI test. PI in and of itself with the tool will map to if this candidate is right for this role. If they're not, you can decide to knock them out, but you still can use, that human decision making to say that you're going to knock them in. Maybe you're going to rescope the role for them. But it really helps narrow in on the talent's alignment to the role for more successful outcomes, or higher likelihood that they're going to be, successful in that role. So it's very important for us to use.
Again, if anyone has a question or comment, please, Mike, I think you just unmuted. So
Yeah.
good. That's good.
I guess because I'm an old guy and trying to catch up with all of this stuff, I have a very simple question, and it has nothing to do with artificial intelligence or predictive index and so on. What I have is the question about how does HR earn the right to a seat at the table with the executive team, with all of this going on? Because what I see is, in a lot of cases, HR is an afterthought in a lot of these organizations, and they're desperate to be able to sit at the table and participate in meaningful discussions about how we're going to move forward, how we're going to implement the strategy, how we're going to be able to really make the values come to life. So where I'm coming from is, how does HR in today's day and age earn a seat at the table with all of this stuff going on? Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. Such a good question. James, do you want to share anything?
No, I was just, I have to smile at Mike's question, because I was going to ask, essentially the same question, but using slightly different words about you
have bigger words than me.
No, not as profound, perhaps. But it's really, as Mike was saying, in the world of tomorrow, or today going into tomorrow, what would be the role that you would see for HR? Not necessarily on the current trajectory, but the role that you would see that HR would have to play to be able to help us navigate all the changes that we're going through, but successfully. So it's fundamentally the same question Mike had to ask. That's why I was smiling. So,
well, a wonderful question. Both great ways of saying it and asking it. So the wonderful thing about humans and why AI works and will work is because we're actually habitual. And if you observe long enough, you recognize patterns within human behavior. And so, Mike, to answer your question, I'll kind of share a narrative or a story.
Yeah.
I meet with a new CEO, and they're reaching out because they just want HR fractional services. They need a payroll provider for 3 months.
Yeah.
So we provide that. I don't have a conversation with him about headcount. I don't ask him about, kind of maybe audits or compliance or even their payroll company. I say, tell me where you want to be in 3 to 5 years. Where are you taking the company? And they don't know how to answer that because, like you said, how does HR earn that right? How do we earn that seat at the table? So they're wondering why I'm even asking that.
Yeah.
I said, no. Like this, we're going to have a kind of a strategy conversation right now. I really need to know, where are you planning on taking the company in 3 to 5 years? And we have a great conversation around that. And then I ask them, so how are you going to achieve it? And they might know, they might not. But then I ask them, and how are you essentially operationalizing your people to ensure that's going to happen? And that's when the light bulbs start to go off and they realize, I really don't have a plan for a people program. My managers don't know what to do with their people. They have so many issues right now. Like we have, 5 employees on a performance improvement plan, a PIP. I don't know. We can't even get the right people in the door. So I can't answer that question today. So just by asking that question on, kind of reverse engineering from, kind of a high level business planning conversation and question, and then backing them, through how they're going to achieve that, starting today, that's how we earn that seat at the table, because I understand some of the complications that they are going to encounter if they do not implement certain elements of, a really proactive human capital program.
So,
go ahead.
So, Christine, are you saying that for you, the head of HR or chief of human resources in the near future, or perhaps tomorrow, literally, would be the Chief Talent Optimization Officer.
Yes, I am.
Well, that's
a great
exciting. No,
I
but that's
just
exciting.
want to note Renuka has a question, and Renuka, I would love to hear what you are thinking.
And then I have another question
Oh,
too.
yes,
So
yes.
after that, I'll wave
Yes,
my hand.
absolutely.
Kind of following up with Mike's question and the answer that you provided. So we are essentially talking about a hybrid workforce when it comes to bringing AI into force, right? So the main thing for HR, I think, to be like about the clarity about the roles and responsibilities, right? And then it's a matter of pinning responsibility, accountability, and to the right worker, maybe a human or a machine, right? So to do that, you need to create the right culture, and people are resistant to change. So what do you think are barriers to adoption of AI technologies in that perspective?
That's a great question, Renuka. I think first and foremost, and I love that you shared people are resistant to change. That's exactly it. But I think the first barrier to AI technology is legal. I advised a couple AI firms, and legal held it up every time because legal is not comfortable with it yet. And it's going to take a lot of work. But then beyond that, it's developing trust around the AI. A lot of the individuals that we were speaking with for these two separate technologies, which we're trying to measure human connection for greater kind of belonging and acceptance. A lot of people believed that the AI was tracking them, in a negative context, not monitoring the inner levels of communication to essentially provide those insights that would have been really helpful for them to understand. And so, for better or worse, I think as people, we have a resistance to technology because for privacy and security reasons. And that's going to take a lot of work to design the technology in a way so it can be trusted.
Yeah. Can I ask another question, James? Am I allowed one more?
It's John, and the answer is yes. I'll speak for John.
Absolutely, Mike, please.
I just want to, I'm working with a large recruitment firm right now to help them with their strategy for growth. And I'm wondering, what are the implications for, your kind of common everyday, HR recruitment firm when you think about all of the stuff that you've been talking about, because they're operating under an old model, if you will, in most cases, which is just find a warm body and see whether or not an employer will take them. And I just wonder if you've got any point of view on how recruitment firms or HR talent management firms, capital management firms, whatever you want to call them, how all of this impacts those organizations and that whole industry.
Mm-hmm. Great question. I believe there will always be a war on talent, because we will always need people, to get the job done, whether it's a product or a service. Yes, we can innovate, but we'll still need people. So for, kind of the recruiting industry, it's no longer enough, I think, to get, reasonably viable candidates through the door. What we advise our clients on who have recruiting firms or, kind of a third party supporting them is that company really doing you a service? And do they truly understand your business and the value that working for your organization versus a competitor is going to provide that individual? Why is this company, this client, the entire kind of work experience so unique that it is a distinctive, competency for the client? And that's where I think a lot of recruiting firms still, they're just not getting. I think in some ways they just don't care enough to learn about their clients and become passionate, like the client is passionate about their work.
Yeah.
So they're just not selling it right.
No, they're just looking for a warm bum in a seat somewhere. It's a highly technical term we use in Canada, but that I find it interesting that there's this disparity between what you're talking about and what recruitment firms are actually doing and what HR groups are actually doing. There's a big gap there still.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well said.
I would just like to note we've reached the end of our hour. This has been a fascinating discussion. I would like to add one point. I believe we are in the process, intentionally or unintentionally, as a society, creating a new organizational model. And I monitor technologies that are peripheral to organizational models, but show the direction. Technology companies are that work in that create technologies for business functions are preparing for a new organizational model. I monitor Microsoft. Microsoft has a far-ranging vision for how human capital will be organized. It's radically different from today, and I believe there's going to be a new era of talent management businesses that are able to help organizations figure out how humans and AI interact in a way that's favorable to the bottom line and respects law and ethics. I believe it's going to be a completely new model. And it's something I hope we can explore in future webinars, but we are over time. So Christine, thank you very much for participating, sharing your knowledge and insights. Thanks to everyone who attended. Thanks to everyone for your comments and questions. Has been an interesting session. There will be a recording of this, and we will be making clips that people can link to as well. And I hope, Christine, that you'll be in more webinars in the future, because there are a lot of topics to discuss, and I think we have a unique perspective to offer in our webinar series. So thank you very much.